Okay, Carol, we're live on Facebook.
Welcome to the ERA Coalition Town Hall as we examine the pandemic of violence, the pandemic of COVID-19, and the Equal Rights Amendment. Our participants are Senator Richard Blumenthal, ERA supporter and author of domestic violence legislation and one of our country's strongest voices for the protections of the rights of women and girls. Jessica Lenahan of the Supreme Court case Gonzales v. United States 20 years ago. Jessica's 3 young daughters lost their lives to her estranged husband. She's been an advocate ever since. Baldwin Moody, President and CEO of Legal Momentum, the Women's Legal Defense and Education Fund, home of the Syms Helpline for gender-based discrimination or violence. Terri, Poore, Policy Director, National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. Bettinger-Lopez, one of Jessica Lenahan's longtime lawyers and director of the Human Rights Clinic at the University of Miami School of Law. Nevada State Senator Pat Spearman, proponent of more strenuous legislation that will protect women and children. Lisa Sales, Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance. She's on the policy committee there. And Jessica Neuwirth, co-founder and co-president of the ERA Coalition and author of Equal Means Equal, Why the Time for an Equal Rights Amendment is Now, and we might say right now. Hello, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm Carol Jenkins. I'm co-president and CEO of the ERA Coalition and the Fund for Women's Equality. We are now over 100 organizations strong, representing millions of girls and women across this country who are ready for the Equal Rights Amendment. In fact, they're ready for equality. I want to make a couple of notes. Number one, we are recording this event so that it can be viewed afterwards. Many people have asked us for that. And also that we're going to be joined by Senator Blumenthal shortly, and when he does join us, we'll break for that. But there are perhaps few stories that speak to our sense of outrage and the need for the Equal Rights Amendment more than that of Jessica Lenahan. 20 years ago now, her daughters lost their lives. She is a fierce advocate for ending domestic violence and for putting the ERA in the Constitution. We're so honored to have her with us tonight. She's one of our heroes. I cannot praise her enough for the work that she's done in these last 20 years. And we also have her longtime lawyer, Caroline Bettinger-Lopez. And I'd like Caroline to begin and frame for us the Lenahan story all the way to the Supreme Court and beyond that, and where things stand now. Carrie, thanks.
Thank you, Carol, and thanks to the ERA Coalition for putting this together. It's really wonderful to be together in this virtual space, and I'm honored to be on this amazing panel. As Carol said, Jessica Lenahan is a hero to so many of us, a shiro, as we may say, and so I have the great honor and pleasure of not only being her lawyer, but also being her colleague and working alongside her in this struggle for women's equality. So Jessica's story is very familiar to probably many on the town hall, but perhaps not everyone. And so without getting into all of the details of her case, in short, Jessica got an order of protection, as Carol said, after her estranged husband threatened her and her children. She called the police repeatedly when her husband violated the order. The police ignored her calls for help, and for almost 10 hours, she repeatedly called them and had contact with them to no avail. Tragically, her husband showed up at the police station and opened fire in the middle of the night. And when the police went to the car, they found the bodies of the 3 girls inside the car. It's one of our country's great tragedies, and it happened over 20 years ago, and Jessica is still struggling for answers. But Jessica demanded justice immediately. She knew that she had been wronged. She went to the federal courts, and she found a lawyer after much searching because no one wanted to take her case. She found a lawyer. She brought her case up to the, and it went all the way up to the US Supreme Court. And the big question was, did the Colorado police, in this case, the Castle Rock police, have a responsibility to enforce her restraining order under the US Constitution? The Supreme Court shockingly found that the Constitution did not provide her with any sort of legal right to have her restraining order enforced. And so Jessica and her mother demanded justice. They pushed the lawyers in the case. They pushed all of society to say, we have to hold the Supreme Court accountable. We have to hold the police department accountable. We have to change society so that these restraining orders are actually taken seriously, so that women's voices are valued. And so with Jessica's, as both my client and my collaborator, as I say, we brought her case to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is an international human rights body that oversees human rights across the Americas, including in the United States. And Jessica brought the first ever case against the United States on behalf of a domestic violence victim before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights.
Thanks so much, Carrie. And Jessica, I want to turn to you now. We were looking at some footage from our 2018 shadow hearing on the Capitol. That was the hearing we did to demonstrate to the representatives there what a real hearing on the ERA would look like. And your testimony there was so powerful that we always say, Jessica got the time limit removed in the House of Representatives by that testimony that she did in the shadow hearing, which resulted in a real hearing the next year, and this year, of course, the vote to remove the time limit. Talk to us, about how you feel about the connection between the Equal Rights Amendment and your case and domestic violence, sexual aggression in this country.
For me, I think losing the children, and I think as mothers, that's the worst thing that can happen, whether it happens in court or, of course, the alternative, which is death. And so my whole mind frame is always about saving lives. And for me to prevent what happened to me was the most important journey I've taken since being a mother. At the time that I was invited into the Equal Rights Amendment's arms, welcoming me so warmly, and understanding my need for justice and wanting to see the liberties and rights that men are ensured, that women should also have the dignity of that respect through the ERA. And it's sad that we have to fight for it, that it's not just a given liberty through, fortunately, but it is something I'm committed to until we get it done. And
right.
We're
so glad we have you on our side, Jessica, and we're definitely on your side, and there will be justice. I'm also pleased to say that we are now joined by Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, a supporter of the ERA, the Violence Against Women Act, and sponsor of the Lori Jackson Domestic Violence Survivor Protection Act, which would prevent anyone subject to a temporary restraining order now from having access to a gun. Senator Blumenthal, thanks so much for being with us today. If you could, Senator, if you could unmute yourself, we are so eager to hear. There we are. Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I'm really delighted and honored, and thank you for all your great work, and I really appreciate being with you.
Tell us a little bit about SJ Res 6, the Cardin-Murkowski bipartisan bill to remove the timeline. We're very eager to know its prospects in the Judiciary Committee about whether or not we can get to a vote in the Senate at all. Forgive us if we do a strictly ERA question, but Senator.
I think the key here, and I'm just going to be very blunt in the interest of both time, and I know how well informed you are. The issue here is Mitch McConnell and whether he gives us a vote. You're absolutely right. It's a bipartisan resolution. It would extend the time for approval of this very critically and historically necessary measure. And you mentioned domestic violence at the outset, which has become more urgent as a consequence of the pandemic. Discrimination on campus and violence there, more urgent because of the DeVos regulation. Pay discrimination, more urgent because of the threats to the frontline workers, not only their physical health, but their economic well-being. Again and again and again on all these issues, the disparities that we see between women and men in the workplace, in hospitals, in nursing homes, the ERA is the remedy, but Mitch McConnell is the obstacle. And I think we need to do the kind of organizing and advocacy that you are doing so eloquently and powerfully through this kind of gathering. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very grateful for it. So what are the prospects? I think that Mitch McConnell will dictate the result. And right now, he will probably refuse to move it through the Judiciary Committee.
So we've heard that. Thank you for confirming it. We're still working, looking for more bipartisan support. We do that almost on a daily basis. We have the Democratic caucus that's made it a mission, priority, and we have Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, the only Republicans who have joined. But so I think that in terms of your working with across the aisle, are you optimistic that there's any give there in terms of co-sponsorship or voting for it should it come to the floor in some miraculous way?
I'm a member of the Judiciary Committee. Neither Ben Cardin nor Lisa Murkowski are, but I'm hopeful that some of my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee will support it. I've talked to a number of them about it on issues like VAWA, which again, as you know, passed the House. We're still waiting for a vote in the Senate, but I've worked on this issue the other way around. The last reauthorization of VAWA passed the Senate, and then the House, at that point controlled by Republicans, refused to move it. And after a point in time, public pressure had a result. So I think the key here is public pressure, education, awareness. That's what you're doing, and I think it is so tremendously critical on this issue because, after all, it should not be a Republican or Democratic issue. It should not be partisan. It affects women no matter what their party. It affects states, red or blue, and that's what we need to make people aware of.
Well, we're so glad that we have you working for us in so many ways. We have some questions from our audience. Emmy Kohler has the first question for you, Senator Blumenthal. Emmy?
Hi, my name is Emmy Kohler. I'm a resident of South Carolina and a student. I just recently joined Generation Ratify, a youth-led movement to ratify the ERA. Senator Blumenthal, can you discuss the increase in domestic and child abuse during the COVID-19 crisis? What additional resources need to be developed to deal with this?
Well, VAWA and the ERA are key to combating domestic violence. Emmy, thank you for the question. You broke up a little bit in the midst of it, but I think I understood it pretty well. I mentioned earlier, domestic violence is more of a problem now than ever before. Think of it this way, and I talk to a lot of women. I've used this last few months to talk by video conference, by telephone call, by teleconference, and personally to women who are survivors and victims of domestic violence. And I'm actually the founder of a group some 10 years ago called Men Make a Difference, Men Against Domestic Violence, because we have a responsibility. Men have a responsibility, take a stand. We're the role models for other men. Domestic violence is a cycle. 70+% of all men who commit domestic violence have seen or experienced it in their own lives. So I think we need to increase the resources that are available, which is why approving VAWA is so very important. Now, money has been appropriated even though VAWA hasn't been reauthorized. So a lot of this money is going to your state, South Carolina, and there are a lot of groups at the local level that are doing great work on providing shelters, counseling, medical treatment. But here's why it's so urgent right now. Confinement at home increases the stress and anxiety level. The fears and apprehension about breaking an abusive situation is all the more heightened by the fact that people are supposed to stay at home. So very often women, and obviously survivors are principally women, are reluctant to break because they are afraid the shelters will be full, or because it's not safe to go there with their children, who could be vulnerable to the coronavirus. So the combination of stress and anxiety, which makes women more vulnerable at home, plus the lack of opportunities to break that relationship, plus the fear that counseling is less available, all of it heightens the domestic violence vulnerabilities. And that's why mental health at this point with the pandemic, mental health counseling, the kinds of outreach that domestic violence agencies can do. We have a number of great shelters and counseling services in Connecticut, and we're trying to get them more funding, a lot of it through private sources. And your awareness, your work could be very important. And we need the federal government to do more, but there are great opportunities for activists like yourself to be involved. And I really appreciate your being a part of the town hall and being interested in raising this topic. It's really so impressive that you're doing it. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Emmy. Thanks, Senator. The next question was submitted by Karen Francis of the American Association of University Women. We don't quite see her in the lineup, but Bettina Hager, our DC director, will read her question for you. Thanks, Senator.
And thank you. And first, I just want to thank the Senator. Thank you for your incredible leadership. Just passing legislation and moving it forward to increase the rights of women and girls. This is the question from Karen. What are your thoughts about Betsy DeVos's new Title IX regulations?
Great question, Karen. Thank you, Bettina, and thank you for your great work. We love working with you and your team, which are very, very impressive, and you do such a great job representing and reflecting the roles and advocating for women in colleges. And in direct answer to your question, I really strongly disapprove of Betsy DeVos's new rules. There's actually not one of them. This is part of a campaign, as you know, to diminish the rights of women on campus, and particularly victims and survivors of sexual assault. I'm a trial lawyer. I believe in enforcement because it is an effective deterrent. I spent 4.5 years as the United States Attorney, the chief federal law enforcement official in Connecticut, and then 20 years as Attorney General. And when I was Attorney General and afterward as a US Senator, I went to campuses and I listened to advocates on both sides. And what I concluded, and frankly, not too different from what the Obama administration concluded, was that rights of survivors need stronger protection. They need to have an advocate, for example, in proceedings. They need to be believed when they make a credible case. They should not be cross-examined by the perpetrator. They should have rights to be protected when the perpetrator is permitted to be on campus, which shouldn't happen if there's credible evidence to keep them off. In all these kinds of rules, and I won't go into all of them, but Betsy DeVos has turned the tables, essentially. And so I really regret it. Title IX should be given real meaning and real enforcement teeth. That's what I think as a law enforcement officer. And there's a need for due process. I'm, great believer in due process and constitutional rights on both sides. So we don't want anybody railroaded or denied the effective right of advocacy or the right to be heard, right to present evidence, and to seek a fair result. But that's on both sides. And I really regret the DeVos regulations, because clearly on this issue, she is trying to tip the scale, turn the tables, and I'm hoping that we can reverse a lot of what she's doing.
Thank you, Senator. We have one more question for you. I know you have a busy schedule today. Holly Picardi with the League of Women Voters. Holly, your question for the Senator?
I'm Holly Picardi from Florida. I'm affiliated with the League of Women Voters, as Ms. Jenkins said earlier. My question to you, Senator Blumenthal, and thank you for taking it. What happened to the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act during this term in Congress? The House passed its version, but apparently it has stalled in the Senate. If the VAWA is not reauthorized, what will happen to the funding for needs, including domestic violence centers? Thank you.
Thank you to Holly Picardi from Florida. I'm so impressed by the geographic breadth of the folks on this call. Thank you all for being a part of it. Thanks for the great question, Holly. I have been a staunch advocate of VAWA, and of course, not just VAWA as it was originally passed, but as it is now from the House. As you correctly observed, it was passed by the House. It's now literally ready to be voted on in the Senate. And I think our next tactic, frankly, I don't want to give too many things away, but maybe what we'll do is seek unanimous consent and smoke out the Republican. Who's going to come to the floor and oppose it? You know, VAWA, when it was originally passed, was really overwhelming and bipartisan. So much has become partisan. And the same is true of environmental regulation, of many other really American interests in our Congress. And VAWA should be one. Violence against women, should that be partisan? It has become so, unfortunately. And so the consequences will be eventually that funding will be threatened. Maybe not this year, maybe not in the next few months, but it will be threatened eventually. And I know we're not supposed to be, or at least I'm not supposed to be partisan on this call, so I'm not going to be. But if you care about these issues, think about who is representing you in the United States Senate. And I know I have the great opportunity here to talk to a lot of folks from states around the country. And I'm not telling you or advising or suggesting how you should vote, but just the questions you should ask. And that's exactly the question, Holly, that I hope you'll ask your US senators, because frankly, we need this to be, again, a bipartisan issue, because eventually funding for domestic violence agencies will be threatened. Funding for all kinds of equity activities will be threatened. Funding for really essential services to women. And by the way, they're not partisan services. They're to agencies that serve Republicans and Democrats. They're staffed by people who are both Republicans and Democrats. It should be a bipartisan issue. Thanks so much, Holly, for asking that question.
And thanks so much, Senator Blumenthal, for being with us today. I know you're on to your next engagement, but thank you for your work. And thank you for being with us today. And we will, we'll probably be calling your office tomorrow, but we will be in touch.
Please call tomorrow. Thank you, Carol. Thank you very much, by the way, Jessica Lenahan. I'm sorry, I think that maybe I interrupted you, but I was listening to your story and I was, what you had to say, your message, was very moved by it. And thank you so much for being part of this call. And Carol, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. Jessica, is there something that you wanted to say to Senator Blumenthal? As he finishes up.
Thank you. Thank you for advocating for all of us that have experienced domestic violence and have survived, and have given us a voice in the Senate, where we really never really had that opportunity to walk through our senators' doors until people like you in a place of where you could vote and make a difference for the people in a dignified manner and give us a forum in which to be heard is the most important thing, because I know my experience with Colorado officials has not been a good run because they're not with an open door policy such as yourself. So I just wanted to say personally that without you, we would be in a lot of trouble. So I appreciate your vote and that you do all that you can. Thank you.
I will do that, Jessica, and I want to thank you. You know, if I can just say to you very personally, even though we haven't met except through the wonders of the webinar, I am so awed by the courage and strength of women who will put a face and a voice to this issue. It takes such courage to break from an abusive significant other, spouse, partner. It takes such strength to articulate the problem and to put yourself out there in this kind of very public setting. Your face and voice are what will eventually enable us to turn the tide and do more. You are the one who inspires me when I am frustrated, and I am often frustrated and angered and discouraged, but this kind of call, your kind of story, your story really gives us the inspiration to keep moving forward. Thank you so much, Jessica.
And thank you, Senator. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have some questions for Jessica and for Carrie. I believe Allison McKinney Tim from Justice Revival. You have a question for, I believe it's for Carrie and Jessica.
Thank you, Carol. I'm here in Washington, D.C. As Carol mentioned, I'm with Justice Revival. I often teach about the ERA in faith communities where we're seeking to rally greater support for adoption of the ERA. And in doing this, I talk about Jessica's case. I'm honored to be here in person with you, Jessica, and share the admiration that so many others have expressed for your courageous advocacy. And when I talk about your case to a person, you can just tell how much people sense the visceral injustice of the Supreme Court outcome. And when they hear about the Inter-American Commission's ruling, they likewise express a physical relief that there was another answer that spoke justice following your tragic situation. My question is, people frequently ask, what are some of the reforms that the Inter-American Commission ruling has led to here in the United States? How did that ruling create change for other victims of domestic and sexual violence? And how does that ruling also relate to the principles that we're talking about when we speak of the Equal Rights Amendment?
Carrie, do you want
I'd like to say thank you.
Jessica, go right ahead.
Yeah. Oh no, just I will let Carrie address the legal parts of that question. But for me, I think the Inter-American Commission validated the fact that I was not doing anything to subject myself to that kind of abuse or the loss of my family, my children. And it gave me the strength and the ability to want to push on to do our country and how to create prevention in the way of the tools that I learned along the way. Knowing that the Supreme Court decision was based on Colorado law, for instance, and not all states are set up in that fashion. Although Colorado had an obligation to me it's not mandatory for the government actors to do their job or be accountable when they don't. Now, all states are set up differently. And I feel that with restraining orders, we need to be proactive and very vigilant, because it's a very dangerous time to take the control away from an abuser and give it back to the victim so that they can navigate through these hard times. And we are in a pandemic right now with COVID. But if you look at the history of domestic violence, it's been an epidemic in our society for as long as time. And we have to not think about it as it's our neighbor or over there, but that we are all subjected to it, whether we recognize it or not, in some way, shape, or form. And that we not look the other way or be ashamed of it. Those are the stigmas that I had to overcome to be able to get to this place of having a voice. And nobody should have to lose their children to get to this place that I have arrived. I later on will, make some suggestions about restraining orders and protection orders and the methods I think that we've created along the way to make it a less dangerous situation and still get that document to work for people.
Great, great. Carrie, did you want to speak to the legal, sub-legal aspects of that?
Sure. Well, so what Jessica just said, I think, is so important, that the Inter-American Commission recognized that what happened to Jessica was a human rights violation. It was not some case of bad apples. It was not something random that happened, but it was part of a systematic and epidemic problem. And so, we've been listening and hearing the word pandemic and epidemic a lot lately in the COVID context, but the Commission recognized that the problem of domestic violence indeed is a pandemic itself, with the numbers of women and children that experience violence and the blind eye that society turns towards them. And so that's very important, because our courts are often remiss to do that. So that's a very important part of the legal foundation for the case, because once the Commission found as a factual matter that we have this major backdrop of violence against women and a failure of our public actors and private actors to do something about it and to actually even enforce the protections that we guarantee to survivors, the vast majority of whom are women, then the Commission went about both finding the human rights violations in terms of equal protection, and we'll get into that in just a moment, in terms of what equal protection means under the ERA. But the Commission found that Jessica's equal protection rights were violated, that her right to some sort of fair process was violated, that her family rights were violated. And then the Commission called on the United States government to do something about it. And so the Commission issued a set of recommendations for Jessica on an individual level of remedies that the state of Colorado and the United States needed to give to Jessica. And then it issued a set of policy recommendations about things that we as a country can do. And I'll just mention one of those that I think is really, or maybe two I'll mention quickly. One was guidance one was a recommendation that the United States needed to put laws and policies in place that underscored the importance of enforcing orders of protection. And through a series of conversations with the U.S. Department of Justice at the time in 2012 and 2013, advocates sought the DOJ, the Department of Justice, to issue guidance to police about how police could address gender bias in police response to domestic violence and sexual assault, the very problems that underlaid Jessica's case. And in 2015, Attorney General Loretta Lynch issued that guidance. And so that's a very concrete policy development that came out of the U.S. Department of Justice that I believe never would have happened if not for Jessica's voice and her case. And that guidance went to 18,000 police departments across the country and is currently under review by the International Association of Chiefs of Police and other major organizations across the country, policing and women's organizations that are looking into how to implement that guidance. And they're going to be coming out with several reports and recommendations soon. And there's a lot of technical advice and other kind of work that's being done by these organizations to really get at this root of gender bias in policing. And may I say, not just gender, but intersectional forms of bias that affects people, marginalized people who are survivors of domestic violence, where police end up turning a blind eye or not responding to them in a meaningful way.
Right. Carrie, thank you. And Jessica, we have one more question for you. Anne von Brock of ERA North Carolina. Anne.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Carol. I'm Anne von Brock from Asheville, North Carolina. I'm a board member of the ERA NC Alliance and chair of the Action Network for the Alliance in North Carolina. First, let me say I'm honored to ask a question of such a distinguished panel. I thank you all for your experience and your commitment, your expertise to fighting violence against women. Jessica Lenahan, I'm somewhat familiar with your tragic case, and along with thousands of women and men, I'm just so sorry for your unspeakable loss. It just sticks with our hearts constantly. My question stems from my understanding of Ms. Lenahan's case, as well as my history of running a domestic violence program here in Asheville. My question is, how would you imagine the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment could change the court's thinking that local law enforcement agencies are allowed discretion in enforcing protective orders?
Carrie, do you want to take that?
Sure. So I think it's really important that we think about how hard it is to bring a case arguing for women's equal rights in this country. We have all of these legal limitations that completely eviscerate the meaning behind the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause is supposed to guarantee equality for all people in this country, and unfortunately our courts have not respected or honored that. And so I think the Equal Rights Amendment would do two things. And by the way, before I forget, I have to show my mom, I'm wearing my mom's ERA pin from the 1970s. So this is carrying on through the generations in my family. And you know, back in the 70s and now, I think what we have to demand the ERA for a couple of reasons. And when we think about Jessica's case, two things immediately come to mind. The first is that symbolically, it's a demand and an insistence on equal rights in our Constitution and a recognition that they do not exist currently. And then secondly, in a very concrete legal way, it would actually open up avenues for making new legal arguments in Jessica's case. And so, for example, in Jessica's case, federal courts have found that a selective withdrawal of police protection is a prototypical denial of equal protection. That's a quote from a federal court. And yet, we're not seeing that police, when police actually deny protection on the basis of sex, which so clearly was was the fact in Jessica's case, we don't see that actually enforced. And so I think that the Equal Rights Amendment would create a stronger foundation for this non-discrimination argument. It would allow us to go to court and say that this was clearly an instance of sex discrimination. We would be able to bring data, which has been gathered and needs to be gathered even more, to show the disproportionate ways in which police respond to domestic violence victims, and especially marginalized domestic violence victims versus victims of other crimes. And we would take that data to court and be able to show under this new legal remedy that discrimination had occurred. And it would be a much more powerful way than our current jurisprudence allows for us to make that case.
Carrie, thank you so much. And I know that you have a deadline too, and have to leave us. Jessica is staying. Thank you so much for your input tonight, as always. Terrific. We have some more panelists that we want to get to. Let us begin. These are and forgive us, but brief introductions and thoughts about what you have so far on the subject, the Equal Rights Amendment and domestic abuse, aggression. Jessica Newworth.
Good evening to everyone, and special hi to Jessica. Wonderful to see you. I wish we could all be together in person. But I'm so glad that the work is going forward, because it couldn't be more urgent, especially with the additional risks to so many women in the area of gender-based violence during this crisis. I think my job is to just give you a general background for those who aren't as familiar with the Equal Rights Amendment and its current status. So just briefly, in 1972, Congress passed the ERA, and it was sent to the states for ratification. 38 states are required by the Constitution, which is 3/4 of the states. Congress put a time limit of 7 years on that ratification in 1972, and it was subsequently extended to 1982. And at that point, 35 states had ratified the ERA. And in terms of ratification, there was then a silence until, and it's just an honor, so much an honor to be with Senator Pat Spearman, because she really reignited the ratification process by getting the Nevada state legislature to ratify the ERA in 2017, which inspired the Illinois state legislature that had been trying for many years also to ratify in 2018. And finally, Virginia, also many years trying. This momentum helped push them across the finish line in 2020, January of this year. So we then had reached the 38 states required by the Constitution, and pretty immediately, those 3 states, Virginia, Nevada, and Illinois, brought a lawsuit to compel the archivist in Congress to put the ERA in the Constitution. And their position is that now that the 38 states have ratified the ERA, it's already in the Constitution, but that hasn't been officially recognized. And so that lawsuit is being contested by the government. The Department of Justice has filed a motion to dismiss it. And we are working on a number of different amicus briefs to support the 3 states in their legal efforts to secure recognition of this amendment, which would be the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. Meanwhile, we had been working in Congress, and it was mentioned earlier by Senator Blumenthal and others, to just get Congress to remove that time limit, because they put it in there, they changed it in 1978. So there's no reason it can't be removed. And that's what happened in the House in February, which was a very exciting moment. The deadline or time limit was completely removed, and that was sent over to the Senate, where Senator Cardin and Senator Murkowski are the co-sponsors. So we have a bipartisan leadership in the Senate. But unfortunately, as you already heard, that bill is languishing there together with VAWA and many other bills, and really hasn't moved forward. And so that's where we are now. We have a lawsuit saying we should just recognize right now the ERA. And we also have congressional efforts to support that lawsuit by just removing the time limit to the extent that it's considered an obstacle. And in terms of obstacles, we are working very actively to try to get more senators. I think every Democratic senator is a co-sponsor at this point, and we have the 2 Republicans that were mentioned together with Senator Murkowski, Senator Collins. But what we need to do is deal with the leadership of the Senate and Mitch McConnell. And I should also mention, since he wasn't mentioned before, Lindsey Graham, the chair of the Judiciary Committee. Both of them have come out against the ERA, and I think they're just out of step with history. So as Senator Spearman showed us very dramatically in 2016, when she tried to get this ratification to happen and it didn't work, if they don't change their minds, then we have to change their seats. That's not only what happened in Nevada, it's what happened in Virginia. And that created the circumstances that allowed us to get to 38 states. So I think it's fair to say closer than we've ever been before to seeing the ERA in the Constitution. And probably I've gone over my minute, so I'll just stop there.
All right, great, thanks. And speaking of minutes, I hope that people have a little bit of flexibility. We really want to spend, more time with our panelists. I have a feeling we're going to go over the sharp 7 o'clock mark. So let's, get to it. Next, Senator Pat Spearman. Speaking of Nevada and starting this whole movement, we're just full of heroes today. So if we could hear from you, what's on your mind today, Senator Spearman?
So thank you all, and it's just I'm delighted to be here. I want to start with a horrific story that I think embodies in more ways than one why the ERA is necessary. There was a story in most of the media outlets. It was August 1st, 2016. And it says this: in Kentucky, a judge was outraged after a female inmate was brought into her courtroom without pants on, having been denied access to female hygiene products for days. Let that settle in for a minute. She was brought before the judge, standing there for an arraignment, and she had no pants on and no feminine hygiene products allowed to her, although she was on her menstrual cycle. And when you read that, in addition to it just being, a stupid act against humanity, you have to ask yourself the question: would that have ever happened? And I don't know what the parallel would be for a man, but I mean, would that ever have happened? And you had, all throughout the process, you had men who were ushering this woman from one place to the next in the criminal justice system, and they never thought to give her the hygiene products that she needed or to give her underwear. And, you can go back and look at the story. So when we start talking about the ERA, some people say that it has, that thought has outlived its usefulness. And I say no, because as long as we have things like that happening, we still need the Equal Rights Amendment. We must be in the Constitution, because there are things that happen to women that if they were to happen to men, it would be a no-brainer. But because we are women, now we have to prove why it wasn't my fault because I had on tight jeans. It wasn't my fault because I had a short skirt. I was not really flirting. We've got to prove those sorts of things. So the Equal Rights Amendment, more now than ever before, I believe, is something that we must press for. And let me say this last thing I'm going to say, because I think one of the panelists said before about women being in horrific situations. We have women who are who were forced into human servitude, human trafficking. And they were forced there as young women, and they are trapped there all the way up until their 30s and 40s. What we did in Nevada last year was, if someone is arrested for prostitution and it is determined that she is actually a victim of human trafficking, then the police must stop interrogation and everything else and contact a social worker, and the social worker then begins to handle the case to extricate that person out of human trafficking. Those are the kinds of things that are no-brainers, that ought to already be not just in state law, but ought to be in federal law, and they will never get there to federal law unless we are written in the Constitution.
Great. Thank you so much, Senator Spearman. Carol Moody, thank you for being with us today.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can. Thank you.
Hello,
for
everybody.
The organization.
Yeah, we've been around for a long time, but you know what? Let's call it what it is. The root of sexual violence is about power and control, okay? And as long as gender equality is not enshrined in the Constitution by the ERA, we're not going to get there. And we heard everybody talk. I mean, it's so sad when the senator talks about VAWA, which we were part of, and the ERA. We can't have this be a partisan issue. And that's, gender equality should not be a partisan issue. And that's why it needs to be in the Constitution. I mean, we believe that, the law is the way to protect women and girls. And we do it through advocacy and education. And it's important for people to understand. And as the senators have been saying, as long as we don't have this in the law, courts can make decisions. We have a whole program on gender bias in the courts. It's not just the police. It's the people who decide the cases. I mean, we shut down the New Jersey judiciary where all the judges were trained because somebody came out and said, well, she deserved to be raped because of how she was dressed. And one thing I can say is that I hope on the screen somewhere I saw it was the Syms Legal Momentum Helpline. You can call that helpline in any state, all 50 states. And if you're experiencing challenges to your physical and economic rights in the workplace, home, or school, you can call that number. And the last thing I want to say is the senator talked about men. You also have to realize that it has to start young. It has to start very, very young. And we have a program that starts with 12-year-olds and their peer educators that teach how to avoid being sexually exploited, how to avoid cyberbullying, how to avoid this. And you got to start really young if we're going to change this as a society, and those people will be voting.
Thanks so much, Carol. Lisa Sales, our Virginia buddy, on the front lines of the ERA in Virginia. Thanks, Lisa, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here with all these esteemed folks. For me, my remark is we do more for the flu. If you look at the CDC statistics, I was calling this also an epidemic or a pandemic before COVID, and COVID is only underscoring those inequities and the violence against women in their homes right now, where they're sequestered with their perpetrators. The numbers for violence against women in America rival those of the flu. So why aren't we giving it the focus and attention that it needs in America? We need to treat this like the sickness it is. Do you know today that if you go into a doctor's office, well, we all know this. When was the last time you were asked, have you ever been a victim of domestic violence? Have you ever been sexually assaulted? Have you ever been a victim of human trafficking? Why isn't that part of your medical record? We talk about our pap smears, right? We talk about other parts of our medical information with our physicians, but we're never asked that as a part of our background and history. And that would yield very important data for us, right? There are medical codes, and we could see how much violence women in America are truly, truly experiencing. And it's important to say and underscore that 3 to 5 women in America die at the hands of an intimate partner. I was saying 400,000. I just checked the statistics this week for another presentation. 800,000 people are sexually assaulted in America as of a 2018 statistic. Now, they're not all women, right? They're mostly women. And human trafficking, there have been 250,000 calls to human trafficking hotlines. So what all of these have in common is that they're disproportionately women, and this needs all of us to the table to fight, right? This movement belongs to us all, and fighting for the ERA can help us get there.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks. Terri, thanks so much for being with us today.
Wonderful to be with you and with such distinguished leaders and activists working on this issue. The National Alliance to End Sexual Violence is the voice in Washington of the 56 state and territorial coalitions and 1,500 local sexual assault programs, providing the frontline response in their communities every day to the problem of sexual assault. And we work on issues from the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, trying to fund programs like the Sexual Assault Services Program and the Rape Prevention and Education Program. And right now, trying to get emergency funding for sexual assault programs in stimulus legislation from Congress. So that's a very important piece. We also see this work on the Equal Rights Amendment as inextricably linked with our work to end sexual violence. This past year, the CDC put out a technical package about sexual violence prevention. And what they said is one of the essential strategies to prevent sexual violence is the empowerment of women and girls. And that goes absolutely hand in hand with passing the Equal Rights Amendment. So we're just really glad to be your partners as we work specifically on issues to end sexual assault, to fund programs that respond to survivors. We also want to work to pass the ERA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terri. So we have a few questions. Everybody okay? Let us know if you have to have to leave for your next Zoom, but we have Lilian Medina Romero, Escuchando a las Mujeres. Lilian, your question for Jessica Dewar.
Oh, hi. Thank you for letting me participate and asking this question. Just a little bit of background. I've worked with, specifically with immigrant, Latinx community, survivors of domestic violence. And so part of what the center would say is we need public pressure, right? We need people to support these, and we need, I guess, women and survivors to be aware of the power behind the Equal Rights Amendment, right? So I want to know what's the direct impact of passing the Equal Rights Amendment. And I understand part of it is a constitutional legal argument, right, for survivors. But my question is more addressed. If I have a woman that has survived domestic violence ask me this question, I want to be able to say, this is how much different the situation will be for you and for all of us that you know, are exposed or might be exposed to a situation of violence.
Jessica?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think what Jessica Lenahan's case shows us so dramatically is the need for remedies. She went all the way up to the Supreme Court and couldn't get justice in the most outrageous case of violence by the police, by her husband. And then she went to the Inter-American Commission, and one of the main reasons she won at the Inter-American Commission was because they were looking at language that's like the ERA, that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. And they said, like anyone would looking at this case, this is discrimination on the basis of sex. So I think it's really important. I'm a lawyer, but I think more generally, you know, if you want to change the culture, you need to start by ending impunity and creating a sense of accountability. And I just want to take a moment. I feel like there's so much going on right now in this country. And gender-based violence is, as someone just said, an abuse of power. And the march that was in 2017, the Women's March, was so much about solidarity. And when we look at this tragic killing of George Floyd, I think we just have to bear in mind that is abuse of power. And if we don't live in a country that demands accountability for all abuse of power, then none of us will really get where we need to be. Because equality is equality for everyone, or it's not equality really for anyone. And I just think that what the ERA will do very concretely is give someone like Jessica Lenahan, I mean, hopefully there at some point, if there's enough accountability, will not be another case like that. But right now we have these cases right and left. You know, the case that Senator Spearman just mentioned, you know, we need to create a sense of justice. And when we have a culture of justice and accountability, then I think a lot of social change can also go hand in hand with that kind of legal change. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Lillian, did it answer the question? Call Jessica tomorrow if you need more. Yeah, we'll give you
Yes.
her phone. We'll give you her phone number.
Thank you.
I can help if you need me to. If
Okay.
I may add something, this is Jessica Lenahan.
Sure, of course.
You know, it's so important that we realize that with the ERA, it means equality. And the quality of life comes with that status in our Constitution. It means that we get treated with dignity and respect, and the war on women starts to halt a little bit. It'll never end because men will always be men, but they can be taught. It's kind of like a doggy video. You know, men can be retrained. They really can. And it's up to us, because we're the wiser of the two genders, honestly, to be able to impose that on them. And when there's repercussions for them, because it's our right to be treated with every respect and every equality given to them so freely that they don't even know the gift they have. And what Senator Spearman was talking about just outraged me, because that woman's basic needs were all controlled in a prison where you're government property. You are no longer a free citizen to do as you please. You are at their mercy. And I think that's the whole of it, is that we tend to stay away from law enforcement instead of going to them for assistance. I'd like to mention with restraining orders very briefly that they did fail me, but it also kept a paper trail going so that Simon could not remove my children from my custody. Also, I think that we need to remind each other all of the time. My son Jesse calls it a bug out bag. And so it's ready, a bag is ready for whatever emergency you may come across. He's in the Air Force. And for victims to stay in a place of control, we need to have these bug out bags with simple things like a little bit of money, extra clothes like your basics, your birth certificates, your social security cards, and make sure they're in a secure place that you know you can go to. But just before you file that restraining order, be sure to go to your local police station and ask what their procedures are in enforcement for that order.
Great,
Because
thank you,
you're leaving a paper trail.
Right, thank you so much. I don't know if you,
to be protected.
right, if you hear the noise behind me, it means at 7 o'clock my neighbors are setting up a huge ruckus in support of our essential workers every night at 7 o'clock. They've been doing this. I want to bring up Drew Levasseur, who has just joined our board of directors. Thank you for that, Drew, and thank you for the terrific work you've been doing. You've got a question for a couple of our guests.
I do. Thanks for having me here. I'm a transgender civil rights attorney, and among the women who are at the crossroads of the issue of violence against women, who are often left out of the conversation, are transgender women. The FBI reports that 1 in 5 murders in the United States are based on anti-LGBT bias. And of those murders, transgender women of color, particularly Black transgender women, experience the highest rate. And many of those murders are by intimate partners. Could panelists please discuss the impact of the ERA on violence against transgender women of color?
Pat Spearman?
Yeah, thank you. So here's what I'll say. I know that we always quantify, if you will, women, but the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, is for women, but in my mind, it's equality for all, because it stands for the elimination and the eradication of all vestiges associated with whatever the ism is. When I show up in a room, at a meeting, wherever I am, when I show up as a triple threat. You know why? Because I'm Black, I'm a woman, and I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. Oh, and by the way, I'm also an ordained minister. And so that kind of neutralizes some of that. But when I walk into the room, anyone who has any type of fetish or about isms, I challenge that just because I'm there. And so the effect that it will have on transgender women is that transgender women are women. They are women.
Great, great, thank you. We're going now to Roman James, who's a domestic violence activist. Thank you for your patience. You signed on really early today. We're glad to have you for the full. Hi, Roman. Thank you for your patience. Your question? For Lisa Sales, I believe.
So my question, as a survivor in dealing with the issue of custody and violence and how that's quite often diminished in the court system or the legal justice system, is, domestic violence is a public health crisis, and it affects all areas of our society. And I just don't understand, with the estimated cost of $3.6 trillion spent annually to deal with issues of domestic violence, why it has not raised or risen to the level of a public health crisis, and when are we going to reconcile that issue with how women are being denied justice, because domestic violence infiltrates every area of our lives as a
Lisa?
society.
Yeah, Lisa?
Yeah, well, so definitely domestic and sexual violence, I'm a survivor too, so from one survivor to the other, and have experienced both domestic and sexual violence. I usually only tell the story about the sexual violence. But I think, look, it impacts communities, families, bottom lines, and it's not being addressed as the epidemic it is. That's why I said we do more for the flu. So why aren't we raising this as a health issue? And I think one of the ways that together as a community in this movement, things we can do together is to engage, not keep it to a forum of, to this small knit group. Go to your members of Congress, go to your state legislators, get involved with your boards of supervisors, your city council. We have to elevate the issue and tell them. We can't expect them to be mind readers. We have to communicate the significance, the importance. And of course, people always respond to their wallets. And unfortunately, if we have to speak to them through their wallets instead of their hearts and their minds, then let's do that. Let's bring that to them and let's make the difference. Let's be the change we want to, we want to see. So it's up to every one of us to have a role in communicating how important this issue is. Like, why isn't it elevated to a flu epidemic? We have a sexual violence epidemic, a domestic violence epidemic in America. It's supposed to be the greatest country on earth, right? What are we doing about it?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Carol Moody, we have a question for you, submitted by Carol Comito, but Bettina will read it for you.
Hi, thank you. So the question for you, Carol, is how can we reach women who need our help, and how can they reach us safely?
Well, first of all, we have, and on our website, we have put together, particularly in this pandemic, it's a national resource of where you can get help. But obviously, as I said, we've got a helpline up there that is, all states where you can call. And if we don't have the answer, we tell you where to go. And I think that's the key. We have resources in every state that tells you how you can get help safely. And how do we reach women? That's what I said. It's called the Legal Defense Education Fund. We spend almost half of our time doing just that, educating people and women and girls, as I said before, starting as early as 12, about what the issues are, what it means to be, the whole thing about oppression and power. So how do we reach women? You got to get out there in every forum that you have that you can touch, whether it's church, somebody talked about the faith base. You have to get out there, schools, churches, and of course, your policy makers, and educate them so they can figure out how to get it. We have a resource guide that's very, very particular to different groups, domestic workers, farm workers. You have to be able to get the information to them in a way that they can understand it. And we've actually translated ours into Spanish and Chinese. So the bottom line is, how do we reach women who need our help? You've got to go where it is that they feel comfortable to hear it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, great. And the Syms Helpline, funded by the Syms Foundation, Marcy Syms, who happens to be one of our chairs as well of the Fund for Women's Equality. So great work that.
And it's up, I hope it's on the board. I hope that you can see it on the board, how to call. You can go to our website.
We'll have it as we're closing out. And now we have a question for Terri.
I just wanted to piggyback for a second on what Carol was saying. Also, Jessica has stepped out and has been telling her personal story, and never underestimate the power of telling your personal story, because that will touch people's hearts and minds along with their wallets. So it's why I came out. I learned that there was a connection after. Don't wait to be sexually assaulted or to experience domestic violence before you get active, right? It was then that I made the connection between a lack of equality for women and the violence we experience. So tell your personal stories. That's when I started telling mine. And if you don't tell it for any other reason than to get a constitutional amendment that puts women in the Constitution, then.
Right. Let's put women in the Constitution, right? Thanks, Lisa. Isabella Epstein, who is our intern from Yale University, helping us put our town halls together and do our ERA work, has a question for Terri Poole. Isabella.
Hi, yes, Terri, thank you so much for joining us. I'm wondering what I and others like myself can do to get involved to help advocate for victims and their rights.
This is such a great time to be involved in these issues, everything from working to passing the ERA to passing the Violence Against Women Act. Right now, we need to get in touch with our senators about the need for emergency funding for sexual assault programs in the next COVID package that they're going to pass. So that's something you can do right away. We have a district advocacy toolkit through Reliance. And the thing I mostly want to say about that is that I just want to empower you and everyone to know that your representatives, your senators at the federal and state level, they represent you. You have every right to call them, to visit. Right now, you wouldn't visit their offices in person, but it's kind of wonderful because you can call the office, get an email address of a staffer, and weigh in about the issues you care about and talk about the need for emergency funding for domestic violence and sexual assault, talk about the ERA, and you can look up your senator right on the internet, look up their phone number and make a phone call tomorrow. And I hope that you'll do that.
Great. Well, thank you all.
I'm sorry,
yeah, Lisa, go right ahead.
You know, join your local commissions for women. If you don't have a commission for women, start one up. Become a part of your council to end domestic violence, right? Make your voice heard, get involved, create a resolution, bring it to your state house. That change the law. You have the power to change the law. This is your democracy. This is your country. So let's take it back.
Right, and if you follow Lisa's example, she's on about 20 commissions and, engaged in 30, goals there. But thank you all so much, as you all are terrifically involved and engaged in the equal rights work and in the domestic violence and sexual aggression work. And we thank you all so much for being with us today. You're really tremendous. We want to put up the helpline graphics so that you can see that. And this will be up on our website as well and in our social media. If you need to reach out for help, there's also the National Domestic Hotline as well. And speaking of reaching your senators, we want you also to go to our website, eracoalition.org. If you go to the advocacy page, there's a map. You click on your state, you will find your senator. You can reach your senator and tell her or him that you want SJ Res 6 passed, brought to the floor, and removing the time limit on the Equal Rights Amendment. Sign up for our newsletters. And we also want you to know that we will be holding 2 more town halls. The next one will be about girls and women of color. And the one after that will be gender expression. So we want you to be engaged with us to come back for those as well. In the meantime, thank you so much for being with us, the panelists, our guests, and all of you watching. It will be up on our Facebook page, and we know that that's where a lot of people access it later. So thanks all so much, and to our staff, thank you very much for all of the input this week. We will see you at the next town hall. Thank you.